What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Mike and today I'm going to show you how I built this awesome double X base round table.
Well, that's a round table.
Not that kind of round table. I had a client reach out that was tight on space but needed to seat 8 people at a dining table, so this is what we came up with.
In general, my tool of choice for cutting boards to rough length is the miter saw, but every so often on wider boards the blade will bind, and that means I get to spend the next 5 minutes getting the blade free. It's really one of the best ways to start off a project. Almost. Just a little more. Can't wait to do that again. Maybe I should have used the jigsaw this time. When I build tables and furniture, I rarely build just the top or just the base from start to finish. This allows me to keep making progress on the build while I wait for glue to cure. So for this build video, I wanted to capture that sequence and show you step by step the real-time, so to speak, process I went through for this table. Check out the tension in this board. After ribbing it on the table saw, there was a pretty hefty bow that opened up in the middle. Once everything is rough cut, I sticker the boards and let them rest for a minimum of 24 hours before I go through the milling process. Milling is one of those repetitious steps that I actually enjoy. I put on a podcast or crank up the tunes and watch the grain in the wood begin to come to life underneath that dull, rough sawn surface. I begin by surfacing one face on the joiner, and I remove just enough material so that the boards will run through the planer without rocking as they go through. I then bring the boards down to thickness on the planer and continually evaluate the grain patterns that are emerging. This helps me to decide which side of the board to remove more material from if I have the option, and which side to leave alone. So you may be wondering why we're back at the joiner, but before we can rip our boards to width, we need to first establish a flat edge to run along the rip fence on the table saw. This little mag switch universal feather board has been really helpful in this operation. By keeping the board flat against the fence on the joiner, it allows me to focus a bit more on my technique involved in flattening the edge. So after all of this, I fire up the table saw and I cut the opposite side of these boards with a glue line rip blade. You don't have to have a dedicated glue line rip blade, but I've noticed better glue joints since using one, so that's why I take the time to change out the blade. So I know it looks like I'm just drawing some smileys and frownies, but when it comes to gluing up a tabletop or panel, it's really important to make sure that the grain direction is alternating. This is one big step that helps to keep the top flat over time. While I'm mindful to keep the grain in each of the boards alternated, I'm also deciding the final layout of these boards so that way the top of the table is as uniform and pretty as possible. With my boards arranged, I work on laying out for dominoes. And a thing to make sure of here is to not cut through a domino when the top is cut round.
Well, that would be bad.
So I space them every 10 inches or so, and I obviously make sure to keep a fair margin away from the edge. The main reason I add dominoes to tabletops is that they help to align the boards with each other during the glue up so that the top is nice and flat, and I don't have a ton of cleanup work to do leveling everything out after the glue up. If you don't have access to a domino, it's really not a big deal. You can use a biscuit joiner or even dowels in the same fashion to help keep all of your boards aligned during the glue up. So I'm really not going to be winning any prizes for having the cleanest shop on the planet, but I do try to keep things relatively tidy, so I hook up the vacuum and get started cutting for the dominoes I'll be using in the tabletop. I alternate between the tight and loose settings on the domino to make assembly a bit easier. This way, if I miss my mark a bit when I'm cutting, the boards will still come together with relative ease during the glue up. When it comes to this step, you can really blow it by not setting yourself up for a stress-free glue up. Before I even start gluing and framing in the dominoes, I make sure my clamps are nearby and already opened up. Also, fight the temptation to glue up the entire top in one fell swoop. For me, I can comfortably get 4 boards together per glue up. So for this table, that means I had 3 separate glue ups. When I'm doing this kind of assembly, I drive the dominoes into the small slots first, and the next surface for the glue joint has those wide slots cut in it. This way, I have the extra room for error that I mentioned earlier. If you do this in the opposite order, that could end up making the assembly process a bit more difficult. So once the 3 sections are out of clamps and the glue is cured, I break out these clamp extensions so that I can finish gluing up the entire tabletop. I wanted to take a quick moment and say thanks to one of my sponsors for this video and a longtime supporter of my channel. Betsy Tool makes high quality clamps that perform day in and day out to make my time in the shop more efficient. From the T-track clamps I use with this workbench to trigger clamps and these K-body Revos, their quality outperforms other clamps that I've used over the years, and they're obviously a staple in my shop. I mean, come on, they're all over the place. With the tabletop and clamps, I shift my focus and I start working on the table base. So once my stock is milled to its final thickness and width, I'm ready to cut the half laps. In a previous video, I went through my process of cutting this joint and gluing up the half laps. So I'll have that video linked at the end so you can check it out for a bit of extra info on this process if you'd like. There are several different approaches to cutting half laps. Generally, I would cut them on the table saw, miter saw, or radial arm saw, and if the half laps are especially large, I would put a dado stack in just to speed up that process. But since these boards are fairly hefty and the joint is at an angle, I wasn't as keen on those options, and I went with using a router in conjunction with a template. So once both halves of the joint are cut, I do a little test fit, and yeah, that's pretty snug. So snug, in fact, that these are a bit difficult to pull back apart. Whew, got it. Now, before I glue this thing together, I go ahead and sand the edges of these pieces. Doing this now instead of after the glue up makes the process much smoother, but I do want to make sure that I don't sand in the area of the half lap because then I could loosen the joint if I'm not careful. So here I'm using my 5-inch random orbit sander from Surf Prep. This little guy balances really well along the edge and is easy to control. So once I'm done sanding, I break out the staple of any arts and crafts project, and I do my best to only put a small amount of glue at the corners of the joints in an effort to reduce the amount of squeeze out I'll have to clean up from those tight inside corners after the glue cures. So I grab 4 trigger clamps to close up the joint and then use a little squeegee to wipe up most of the excess glue. With the glue cured, it's time for a bit of layout work. I start off by determining the center line, and I also mark where I'll cut this piece in just a few minutes. Basically, I want to cut a section out of the piece that matches the thickness. Remember that big template I used earlier for cutting the half laps? Well, the reason that template was so large is so that I could mark the ends of each piece. On one of the boards, I need to transfer those layout lines around the opposite side. So once all my reference lines are on the same surface, I grab a level just to make sure they're in line with one another. To cut the ends of the X's, I grab my track saw and line it up on my layout lines. And then I clamp the track down for just a little bit of extra insurance that it doesn't move during the cut. So even though the saw is plenty strong to cut through this in one go, I take 2 passes just to take it easy. After the first side is cut, I leave the track in place and I use it as a reference surface to register my T-square against and make sure that my layout lines on the opposite side are parallel to the cut that I just made. With that quick dummy chuck out of the way, I repeat the process and I cut the other side. If you don't have a track saw, you could always clamp a straight edge to the piece and then use a circular saw or even a jigsaw to make the cut. Next, I make sure that my cuts are parallel by measuring both ends of the X, and if the measurements on both ends match, then my cuts are parallel. With both of the X's cut, I now have to do something just a little bit terrifying. I set up one of the X's on my ACS, and I cut out a chunk from the middle that matches the thickness of these pieces. It's kind of cool to see the cross section of the half lap though. On the uncut X, I get to work laying out where the dominoes need to be located. I simply mark my center line and then lay out the number of dominoes I want. I then draw a center line on one of the cut X's and I line it up with my layout lines on the other piece, and then I transfer all of those locations where the dominoes will be. So again, if you don't have access to a domino, you can absolutely use some long 1/2-inch dowels and that will still be plenty strong to make this joint. So when it comes to using the domino on the face of a board as opposed to the edge of a board, I like to attach a temporary fence to my workpiece to help me locate the tool accurately. I mark a reference line where the edge of the fence needs to be, and then I line up the domino with my layout lines just to double check my layout. I use some painter's tape along with some Starbond medium CA glue and accelerator to hold the fence in place. And I of course have to give the old wiggle test to make sure the glue is cured and that it's not going to move on me when I'm in the middle of cutting. So that I know where I need to line up the tool, I grab a square and I transfer my cut lines up and over the edge of this fence. Now comes the easy part. I just line up with the witness lines and slowly plunge the domino into each of the locations. I know it sounds crazy, but I don't really like chasing parts across the bench. So I grab a couple of trigger clamps and keep these pieces still while I'm working on them. I adjust the plunge depth of the domino joiner so I can run these dominoes into the 2 half sections of the X just a bit deeper and make the joint as strong as possible. Whenever I'm about to do a major glue up, I like to do a dry run first, just to make sure there aren't any boo-boos that I need to fix. For those situations, I have some undersized dominoes that are easy to remove when it's time for the actual glue up. And just listen to that. It's just so good. Well, now it's time to take it all apart and glue it back together so it'll be strong enough to hold that 150-pound tabletop plus Thanksgiving dinner. With a bit of PPE and my 6-inch electric ray sander, I run through the grits. And while I knock out the rest of the sanding on the base, I want to give another shout out to Surf Prep for also sponsoring this video. I've been using their products in my shop since 2019 and I've been very impressed with their sanders. They're lighter than some others, which makes them easy to use, and they have really good dust collection and produce a great finish. I start by driving in just the top and bottom dominoes, and then I had the brilliant idea mid-glue up to lay this down to set the first half X piece. With a bit of glue brushed onto the other end of the dominoes and just a little wiggle, it was in place. Now I drive the remaining dominoes in place and slather some more glue on. I start out by trying to get this piece on the base with it standing up, but quickly resorted to laying it all back down to get that piece in place. To clamp everything together, I cut some clamping cauls and I used these hefty F-style Bessie clamps to pull everything together nice and tight. At the top and bottom where the two X's intersect on the base, there's a hollow that I wanted to fill so that way the joint looks a bit more complete. The easiest way to make these is from an offcut of one of the X's where the angles were cut on the ends of them. I cut a mirrored angle on the piece, which is the perfect fit to fill the void at the top and bottom on the joint. Just a tiny bit of glue so that I don't have to deal with any cleanup, and bloop, the filler piece is in place. The jaws on the trigger clamp were just a touch too big, so I used a small domino as a spacer on the top and bottom pieces, so that way I could get the clamp in there. My client wanted a cross piece at the bottom of the space, but since this part is completely aesthetic, it could be left off the table if you prefer. The only thing you'd have to do is add 3/4 of an inch to the height of the double base from what's listed in the build plans, which are conveniently linked below. So, once the pieces are cut to width and milled to thickness, I lay out for a half lap joint, and as you can see, this time I'll be cutting it on the table saw. Yes, I could have cut this joint faster with a dado stack, but since I'm only cutting one half lap, I didn't bother switching things out. I like to cut the edges of the joint first and make sure that I'm inside of my layout lines, and then I go to town clearing out the middle. Once both pieces are done, I measure off the edge of the half lap and I cut the pieces to final length at the miter saw. I then add a bit more of that sticky stuff and clamp it tight. Just a little bit of on there and yeah, that'll hold it in place. One of the best things that I've bought for the shop in a long time to help my back is this lift table. It allows me to easily move heavy items in the shop and pick up things like this tabletop to then set onto the centipede. So here's my very basic circle cutting jig I use for cutting out big tabletops, or any other big circles I suppose. On the underside of the tabletop, I drill a hole in the center for the pivot pin to locate in, and I like this to be pretty snug. If you're wondering, the answer is yes. Yes, these are in fact specialty weights perfect for holding down the pivot point on my circle cutting jig. I'm using a 3/8 diameter helical downcut bit in my router, and I personally prefer using a plunge router for these kind of processes, but a fixed base router could also be used. I work on cutting out one half of the table at a time so that way my cord and dust hose don't end up being wrapped into a big tangled mess. And once I'm about a 1/4 inch away from cutting all the way through, I grab my jigsaw and cut off the excess. I cut this away in sections so that it's easier to manage, and this way I don't have to worry about the grain splintering on the top as the pieces are being cut free. So now it's off with the circle cutting jig, and I swap out for a top bearing pattern bit in the router to clean up the last little bit of wood that's left behind. If you've ever tried to make a custom table like this before where there's not an apron to hide the mounting hardware behind, you'll get to the step of joining the base and table and ask yourself, now how am I going to do this? There's no part at the big box store that's going to serve this purpose, and I really don't want the 150-pound, 6-foot tabletop falling on Aunt Edna's toes at Thanksgiving dinner because I chose the wrong hardware. So that's where my friends at Bidwell come into the picture. They've made me several custom mounting plates for various projects, and lucky for you, if you want to build this table or one like it, you can order the exact same mounting hardware. All you have to do is go to bidwellwoodaniron.com and look up the Woodshop Mike mounting plate. Also, if you're into saving money, use my code Woodshop Mike at checkout and save 10% on your entire order. With the mounting plates attached to the base, I get to work drawing some layout lines on the bottom of the table. And you remember that hole I drilled for the circle cutting jig? Well, it comes in pretty handy at this point to establish the center of the tabletop. I used a ruler to help mark the corners of each mounting plate, and then with the base removed, I used an extra plate I had on hand and a punch to mark the location of the center bolt holes. I traced the outline of the plate and then drew some center lines to reference my router template off of. And the holes that I'm drilling here are so that the head of the mounting bolts can recess into the underside of the table and allow this mounting plate to sit flush. I made this template to be used with a bushing and bit setup as opposed to a top bearing router bit because I wanted to be able to have the corners as small of a radius as possible. And since I don't want to spend a ton of time routing out these pockets with just a 1/4 inch bit, I set up 2 routers to knock out the task faster. I hogged out the majority of the wood with a 5/8 bit, and then I came back with a smaller 1/4 inch downcut bit. The payoff for this extra work is nailing the fit. There's just enough slot to account for seasonal movement and to make the assembly process easy. With all the mounting plate pockets cut, I get to work laying out for the next routing operation, and I wanted to do this one after establishing the location for the mounting plates because in all honesty, the location of the C-channel is not as critical. So, you may be asking yourself, why in the heck is Mike adding C-channel to this table? That's just crazy. I'm never watching this guy again. Ugh, what a loser. Well, first off, that would be a bummer because you'd miss out on my charming personality and subtle puns.
He seems like such a nice guy.
But the bigger issue of why am I adding C-channel to the underside of this table? Throughout the ages of woodworking, folks have used various methods to help keep tables flat, such as alternating the grain direction and making sure your lumber is dry and acclimated. It's also good to do the milling operation in a couple of phases, with some time between steps to allow the wood to flex or move before milling to final dimensions. And then there are design considerations, such as adding breadboard ends or even having an apron on the base. Well, it'll look kind of silly to have breadboard ends on this table since it's round, and like you can see, there's no apron, so C-channel makes sense. Now, is it going to flatten out a huge curve? No, but it will help to keep a table flat. So, as you probably noticed during my explanation, I switched out the templates and routers to cut the pocket, and this is going to allow the C-channel to sit flush with the underside of the table. With all of the pockets and slots routed in the underside of the table, I put the base back in place and I grab a punch to mark all of the bolt locations for the C-channel and mounting plates. Now that all the hole locations have been marked, well, you guessed, it's time to drill a bunch of holes for all the threaded inserts. You see that little wrap of blue tape around the bit? That's a quick and easy way to set the depth I need to drill to. I definitely don't want to have a boo-boo and drill through the top at this point. Generally, I use either a 3/8 or 7/16 bit for these holes. For softer woods, I go with the 3/8, and for harder woods, I use a 7/16 for just a bit more clearance. Another thing that I do sometimes to make it a little easier to install the inserts is to chamfer the holes with a countersink. I know it's going to seem like there's a lot of back and forth with putting the hardware on and off, but once I get to this point, I like to go ahead and do a quick test fit of all the hardware just in case I need to tweak something before I go through final sanding and finishing. So I start with installing the C-channel, which also came from Bidwell, and then Kathleen gives me a hand setting the base in position so that way I'm not dragging it and putting all kinds of nasty score marks in the woods. And while it does take a bit longer to install all of these screws, I personally like to check the full assembly so that way there aren't any surprises on delivery day. I know, call me crazy.
Oh yeah, crazy.
Since everything went together so beautifully, I couldn't think of anything better to do than to take it back apart. I set the base on a sheet of cardboard so that way the concrete floor wouldn't scuff the hardware, and I get to work securing the cross piece to the bottom of the X's with 2 1.5 inch screws for each leg. I suppose you could call this the bottom of the base. Now it's time to give the edges of this table a little attention, so I'm back at it with my 5-inch sander to make things all nice and pretty. I start off with 80 grit and I work my way up to 120 grit, after which I break the bottom edge with a bit of light hand sanding and some 180 grit sandpaper. For this table, my client went with Rubio Monocoat in the color Corn Silk. I personally love this product because it's so easy to apply and dries quickly, which allows me to keep making progress on a project. It's also really easy to touch up and repair if needed. I guess you could say it's low maintenance, kind of like me, which may be why I like it so much. After the finish on the underside is wrapped up, I throw the C-channel back in and flip over the top and get to work on the final sanding. On large surfaces like this, I grab for my 6-inch Surf Prep sander, which gets me through the sanding process a lot faster. Now for the top, I sand up to 220 grit with the random orbit sander, but then I come back with some 180 grit paper and I sand with the grain and soften the edges by hand. Also, you may notice the moving blanket wrapped around the edge. Since I don't have an overhead track in this area for the dust hose to hang from, I put a blanket over the edge to protect it from the hose dragging and potentially damaging the edge. Once the top is fully sanded to a degree that borders on OCD, I vacuum the surface and wipe it down with Rubio's raw wood cleaner. I really only do this for the top surface of tables, but it does pull a bit more dust off the surface and aids in a smoother finish. The one downside to the raw wood cleaner is that you have to wait for it to fully evaporate before you can apply finish. So while I wait for the top, I turn my attention to finishing the base. And to get into the tight spots of this design, I use a small disposable brush and then buff it out with a white paper towel. But for the areas that are easier to access, I just use a portion of a white Scotch-Brite pad to apply and rub in the finish, and then I buff out and remove the excess with a paper towel. For larger surfaces like a tabletop, I pour out a little bit of Rubio at a time and spread it around with a small squeegee. I again use a Scotch-Brite, but a full size, and paper towel to work the finish into the surface and then buff it out. You'll notice that I worked on this surface in sections rather than taking on the entire tabletop in just one go. That's because you need to limit yourself to areas that you can complete in about 15 minutes or less. Delivery day for me is always fun. It's an opportunity to help see a vision materialize, and there's just something cool about experiencing how something I've made become part of another family's life. As you can see, this isn't the biggest dining area, but since this table is round, it has room to seat 8 people.
As you can see, the table looks amazing in my client's dining area, and if you want to make one of these for yourself or a friend, I have the plans linked in the description below so that you can take it on. If you want to watch more of my woodworking videos, I've got a playlist right here for you. You can watch it all day. Until next time, let the sawdust fly and have fun making something.